Minute 34 de la Legislature in Guam is called to order. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to adopt the session agenda for July 13, 2018.
On the motion to adopt the session agenda for July 13, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to waive session agenda items 2 through 6.
On the motion to waive session agenda items 2 through 6, any objection? Hearing none. Clerk, please take the roll.
Senator Atta. Senator Uggan. Senator Castro. Speaker Cruz.
Present.
Senator Espaldon. Senator Esteves. Senator Lee. Senator Morrison. Senator Muñoz. Senator Nelson. Senator Rodriguez. Senator San Augustine. Senator San Nicolas. Vice Speaker Chalahi. Senator Torres. Mr. Speaker, there is a quorum.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to waive session agenda items 8 and 9.
On that motion, any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move that the message from Imagalahin Guahan be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion to append the message from Imagalahin Guahan be appended to today's session journal, hearing no objections. Legislative Secretary Lee, will you please read the message from Imagalahi into the record?
Hafaday, Mr. Speaker. This message is from the Office of the Governor of Guam, dated July 13th, 2018. Addressed to the Honorable Speaker Benjamin J. F. Cruz y Minute 34 de la Legislature in Guam. Dear Mr. Speaker, attached is Bill number 262-34 COR, entitled An Act Relative to Repealing the Imposition of a General Sales Tax in Guam, which I have vetoed. The obvious inexperience of freshman senators like Regina Lee and Fernando Esteves, combined with the personal motives of senators running for higher office, to include Senators Mike San Nicolas, congressional candidate, Frank Uggan, gubernatorial candidate, and Dennis Rodriguez, gubernatorial candidate, have robbed the Guam Memorial Hospital Authority and the Department of Education of $40 million a year and manufactured a fiscal crisis for fiscal year 2019. Financial and public health experts agree, and the senators admit, that GMH has always been shortchanged. A portion of the revenues earned from the sales tax were intended to finally fix decades of underfunding. The remaining revenue was earmarked for the public schools and the education of Guam's children. And yet, with shocking disregard, the senators have callously turned their backs on the hospital, the schools, and their government in order to further their own interests. Bill 262-34 provides no solutions and serves no purpose other than to, 1, strip GMH of $30 million every year at a time when the hospital needs life-saving facility investments and funding to address accreditation and CMS findings. 2, strip DOE of $10 million every year, thereby crippling any facility repairs and classroom improvements. And 3, manufacture a fiscal crisis by repealing a revenue source without providing and leaving the island with a revenue shortfall of up to $160 million in fiscal year 2019. In short, we have a hospital that for 40 years hasn't received the funding it needs to meet its mandate. We have nearly $100 million in deferred maintenance at public schools and a revenue shortfall of up to $160 million. A repeal of the sales tax without a solution is a catastrophe that will cause the loss of up to 1,500 government jobs, which in turn will trickle down to adversely affect the private sector. Mr. Speaker, you have repeatedly warned your colleagues that the shortfall in revenues caused by the federal tax cuts is real, and that a repeal of the sales tax without an equally real solution is nothing but a fallacy. And I quote, "There are some real tough times ahead. I assure you that the revenue loss is at least $120 million and close to $160 million, if not more." End quote, you told your fellow senators. The loss to the general fund is real. You also said that while painful, there has to be a solution proffered and not just a simple removal to the sales tax provision currently allowed by law. How are we supposed to raise the revenue? I am proud to veto Bill 262-34. It is the most self-serving and irresponsible bill that has ever been passed by any legislature. The senators who voted for it have shown their true colors. Abandoning the hospital and schools and causing the shutdown of government services and a loss of personnel are disasters that will very quickly bleed into and bring down the economy and the private sector. Sinceramente, signed Eddie Baza Calvo.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to waive session agenda items 11 through 13.
On that motion to waive session agenda items 11 through 13, any objection? Hearing none, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, I have a point of order.
Senator Uggan, yes.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that you called the legislature into session, and I'd like to inquire about what the nature of the emergency is, and has there been a declaration of an emergency? To forego a public hearing that has been properly notified, and then call session within hours. My question is, what's the nature of the emergency, and if in fact it has been presented in writing?
The session was called under the authority of the Speaker for a 2 hours notice for a session, and there is no need for...
Mr. Speaker, if I can complete my point of order, in 5 GCA, Section 8108, regarding calling of an emergency, must be certified in writing by a public agency. And in this case, it also recognizes that the legislature is a public agency as it applies to proper notification. The same provision, you are correct, Mr. Speaker, alludes to foregoing an emergency or a properly notified requirement of 5 days, but only based on identifying exactly what the nature of the emergency is. So my question again, Mr. Speaker, based on 5 GCA, subsection 8108, what is the certified emergency for calling this particular session and having to forego properly notified public hearings on legislation that the public could have attended and provided testimony?
There is no hearing that's going to be held. This is a session with one item on the agenda, the override of Bill 262.
Mr. Speaker, there was a previously scheduled hearing at 4 p.m. to discuss several pieces of legislation that was properly notified. But it comes back, Mr. Speaker, to the question, what is the certified emergency as it applies to this, the session and the scheduled agenda?
The emergency is to determine whether or not we have enough money to put a budget together.
Mr. Speaker, the law authorizes the or requires the legislature to transmit a budget to the chief executive, to the governor of Guam, no later than August 31st. So there is ample time to allow the public to be able to participate or to even acknowledge that the legislature is planning some additional subsequent action on this measure or any other measure after the governor vetoes it.
All that is on the agenda today is just the override. There's no session, there's no bill to be heard.
Mr. Speaker, if you can address my point of order based on 5 GCA 8108.
Your point of order is not well taken.
Mr.
You may-
Speaker,
you may
then we
move
should
to-
not be
you
in
may
session.
You may move to overrule the chair if you wish.
Mr. Speaker, in this particular case, let me read the entire code then, if you would like me to.
Please.
5 GCA, subsection 8401, A3. The legislature is a public agency when it is holding a daily session but meetings of political caucuses composed of members, and then it goes on, of the legislature that are now required to be conducted in public. 5 GCA, subsection 8108, special meeting. A special meeting may be called at any time by a public agency by delivering personally and by mail written notice to each member of a public agency. Notice shall also be given to each newspaper of general circulation and broadcasting station which airs a regular local news program within Guam. Such notice must be delivered personally or by mail at least 5 working days, and a second public notice at least 48 hours before the time of such meeting as specified in the notice. The call and notice shall specify the time and place of the special meeting and the business to be transacted. No other business shall be considered at such meetings by the public agency. The 5-day notice and the 48 hours notice may be waived in the event of an emergency certified to in writing by a public agency. A public agency may also consider all necessary business in the event of an emergency. This section shall not require a public agency to give notice of its meetings, and it goes on and with some additional verbiage. So, Mr. Speaker, by law, this body is recognized as a public agency in 5 GCA section 8108. My question again, and my point of order, is what is the emergency, the certified emergency, when in fact this body still has ample time to be able to discuss, formulate, and present a budget to the Chief Executive within the time frame that I had alluded to. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to request a response, please.
This body has met on 2 hours' notice, but if you insist on a written notice for emergency, I will write a written reason for the emergency and call session after that. Thank you. I guess this session is adjourned.